Mythereum Awakenings. Prologue. Chapter 1. The Sword Mage and the Orc. Chapter 2. Meeting the Blacksmith. Chapter 3. Gaining the Gnome. Chapter 4. A Meeting at the Moor. Chapter 5. Orcs and Elves. Chapter 6. A Shimmering. Chapter 7. Bloodied Arena. Chapter 8. Electrifying Metal. Chapter 9. Ambush. Chapter 10. Sounds of Battle. Chapter 11. Downpour. Chapter 12. Cave of Wonders. Chapter 13. Of Dragons. Chapter 14. Rugbod's Despair. Chapter 15. Oasis. Chapter 16. Entering Thanatos. Chapter 17. Crystals and Magic. Chapter 18. Heart of the Empire. Chapter 19. Eye of the Tiger. Chapter 20. The Sorceress. Chapter 21. The Beast Within. Chapter 22. Flight. Chapter 23. Fiery Gates Epilogue. Mythereum Awakenings. This is a tale that starts in the future and ends in the past. Original concept by Salvador Santana. Co-authored by Salvador Santana and Gavin Au. Edited by Emily Cashwell. Epigraph. There was a time when our people covered the land as the waves of a wind-ruffled sea cover its shell-paved floor, but that time long since passed away with the greatness of tribes that are now but a mournful memory. Prologue. Every seed has awakened, and so has animal life. It is through this mysterious power that we too have our being, and we therefore yield to our neighbors, even our animal neighbors, the same right as ourselves to inhabit this land. The sounds, they came to him as he awoke, sharp cries of men and the barking of dogs. As the man opened his eyes, confused and groggy, he could make out figures running towards him. Confusion pulled at his thoughts. The sharp point of someone's stick poked his ribs. "Get up, you dirty rag!" an angry, pitiless voice barked. Whips lashed at him, hands hauled him up, and two men dragged him by the arms to a prison cart and threw him in. His back crunched against hard iron. As he looked around, the man could see others that had been thrown in, mostly stripped bare, whip marks across their backs. The wheels churned as the cart drove across the dusty path. Either side held the sight of men working the fields, the sun beating down on the cart as the men silently bore their pain. The orc surveyed the sunset from his vantage point, looking over a beautiful canyon. He had woken up several hours ago and was still confused, not being able to remember anything, not even who or where he was. Somewhere in the distance, the haunting howls of a creature made him feel uneasy. Hungry and cold, he held the club in his hand tightly as he made his way towards the small settlement in the valley below. Screams and cries grated on his ears as he approached, and several men armed with forks and hoes came to meet him. "Get away, beast!" one cried, poking at him with his fork. "Help me!" the orc growled, but the words sounded like an angry snarl. "Kill it!" someone else screamed. Confused and feeling humiliated, the orc turned and ran back towards the forest he had just emerged from. Losing himself in the trees, he climbed back up the mountainside, looking for somewhere safe to shelter. Darkness and chill surrounded the gnome when his eyes fluttered open. Dusty, arid breaths clogged his throat, and his hands found a length of cloth around his neck, which he pulled over his nose and mouth. His fingers found sharp, angular rock of varying textures, his brain somehow able to identify some of the formations even in the tar blackness of the cave. From somewhere came the endless drip of water, the echo of its falling telling him he was in a large cavern. Then came the sound of hammers ringing on stone, picks chipping at rock as someone nearby began to dig. He yelled, screaming for attention, but the hammering and singing carried on regardless of his plight. He stood on stout legs and made his way around the cave, feeling and listening for any route out. Finding nothing and unable to get the attention of whomever was digging, he fell back down in the darkness. Sometime later, the hammering ceased, leaving the constant drip of water, the only sound, and a rhythm lulling him back to the embrace of sleep and dreams. Immense oaks soared above his head when the elf opened his eyes. Lying on his back, the bright blue skies were dappled by the leaves of tall trees, painting the sky as they danced in the gentle breeze. Lime green leaves told him this was spring, and the woodland around him teemed with life. Shaking his head clear and standing tall, he leaned on the longbow he found in his hand for support. The weapon felt at home in his sturdy grip. Calling out for anyone, the elf tried to recall where he was, who he was, and what had happened to leave him abandoned, alone in this ancient forest. No one answered, and the elf suddenly felt very alone. Birds flitted between the branches, chirping and calling to one another. His only companions as he stumbled along what appeared to be a game trail. Pausing and sitting down on a long fallen log, he looked about, realizing he knew the names and uses of the plants and mosses about him. Grabbing a handful of waterweed and crushing the plant in his hand produced a few drips. Grabbing a handful of waterweed and crushing the plant in his hands produced a few drips, slacking his thirst for a few minutes. Ear-like mushrooms grew at the base of some of the trees, and he gathered a few. Ear-like mushrooms grew at the base of some of the trees, and he gathered a few, peeling the sour skin before eating the more pleasant interior. Confused but unafraid, the elf decided to head east until he discovered some manner of civilization. The heat was beating down on her when she awoke, the ground dry and dusty. Dressed in silks and fine clothing, the woman peered around at the barren landscape she was sat in. She knew something was incredibly wrong, yet could not make sense of it. Everything before this point was lost to her mind, including her name and whole existence. She tried desperately to search her thoughts for some kind of memory to make sense of things. Suddenly she froze. Panic and fear gripped at her lower belly as the thought that she was dead began to take hold. Light brown and stony, the dusty soil around her had not seen rain for a long time. Finally, getting to her feet awkwardly in her fine dress, she stood up and peered about for anything that might jog her memory. A large mound of sand and pebbles was to the right, and ahead of a tree, offering some shade. As she rounded the mound, she caught her breath at the sight of two strange but human-like creatures sleeping. The gasp of shock she let out stirred them from their sleep. The closest looked like a cross between a beautiful woman and a leopard. The other seemed half man and half tiger. His large striped face looked menacing even as it slept. Stepping backward gently so as not to arouse them more, she stumbled and fell. In turn, one of the creatures opened their eyes and looked in her direction. The tiger creature let out a low growling and bared his teeth in a snarl. In an instant, twisting and leaping up, facing her, looking ready to pounce. Frozen in fear, all she could do was close her eyes and hope. Suddenly, without thinking, her hands grabbed at the sandy mound and threw it in the air towards the creatures. Seconds passed in silence, and as she opened her eyes, she saw that the cloud of dust had turned to fibers hanging in the air, trapping the two creatures within an almost invisible cage. The tiger was now raging inside, clawing at the fabric of the cage to no avail, and as she watched in awe, the cage solidified further, apparently impenetrable to the creatures. Peering at the raging and angry faces inside the cage, the woman felt pity. Maybe these beings had just woken her like herself and had no idea who or what they were, but her pity did not reach as far as releasing them for fear of what they might do. Standing up and dusting herself down, she finally looked at them apologetically. "I will bring help," she explained, turning to leave. Off in the distance, a low line of hills jutted like broken teeth in the hazy sky. Her only point of reference, she headed for them, hoping to find help, shelter, and water.
10 years later.
Chapter 1. The Sword Mage and the Orc. A bloated orange sun hung heavy in the sky as the pair made their way toward the poor village in the foothills of the Aronis Mountains. Ripe fruit hung on laden branches in the field around them, but both men knew the people who tended these vines would never drink any of the wine they produced, never eat any of the grapes. "Are you sure this is the place?" a deep voice growled. Children halted to watch the immense creature as it walked into their village, some of the younger ones crying merely from the sight of it. The creature was covered in thickly corded muscles, visible just beneath its light blue skin, which looked more like scar tissue than actual skin. Finger-thick veins pulsed with vital blood as the creature stomped into the village square, massive boots thumping across the packed earth. "This has to be the place he described to me," the orc's companion muttered, casting an eye around the place. Little more than a collection of mud and thatch huts thrown together on the side of a mountain. The nameless village was as harsh and pitiful as any Dazale had ever seen. A few scrawny goats pawed the ground in search of the food they could smell just feet away. Chickens pecked at seeds only they could see, and several wary pairs of eyes stared at the large creature beside them. Vrugbod, Dazale's orc companion, was certainly imposing at 7 feet, yet Dazale gave off a dangerous air of his own. Broad shoulders led to the narrow waist of a trained sword mage, and his bright blue eyes seemed to be everywhere at once. He carried himself with the grace of a dancer, as light on his feet as the performers in the King's Palace 500 miles south. "Why would anyone choose this place?" Dazale commented as he gazed at a pair of scrawny men approaching them. "Maybe coming here was a mistake," he added. "Is there anything I could help you gentlemen with?" one of the men asked. Prematurely aged by the harsh lifestyle in the mountains, the man had leather brown skin and wrinkles deep enough to grow plants in. Despite his seeming youth, he wore an obviously homemade garment that resembled a dress with long sleeves, his clothing patched and dirty. Both men looked fearfully from Dazale to Vrugbod, stepping back slightly to allow Dazale to speak to them. "Gentlemen," Dazale spoke with a natural authority that commanded attention, "I am Dazale, and my tall but peaceful companion here is Vrugbod. We have come to your fine home on the recommendation of a gentleman by the name of Helonius, who, after sharing with us several large decanters of the fine wine you produce in this very village, told us your blacksmith is a gnome called Runbin. Is that correct?" Dazale spoke in a calm voice, though his eyes demanded a response. Yes, sir," the villager responded, as a fly crawled across his right cheek. Dazale smiled, turning to Vrugbod. "Well, my friend, it seems we have found our prize after all." Dazale beamed with satisfaction while his orc companion stood silently. "Tell me, my man," Dazale continued, putting his arm across the villager's shoulders, "is there any chance we could speak to Roddenbin? See him for a few minutes?" "He went to secure some supplies," the villager said. "There have been reports of raiders in the foothills, and so he went to find something to defend us, if they come here." The satisfied look melted from Dazale's face, and he stared at the villager with wide eyes for a moment, before breaking into a smile. "Of course. So tell me, my good fellow, is there an inn around here where we might rest until he returns? It really is important that I speak to him." "Well, not until you get to Slingor Town," the villager said. "It's 10... Ah, yes, we came through there. Beautiful place," Dazale said sarcastically. The villagers chuckled. "Rather than returning to that pit, is there anywhere here we might stay?" "Unfortunately not, sir. We're crowded as it is, and nowhere we can build a fire, throw our bedrolls down. We're relatively hardy," Dazale insisted. "Well, yes, I suppose there is, but..." "Great! It's settled then," Dazale declared, holding his hand out. "But we've..." "Lead on, sir," Dazale said. "Lead on." The lithe man hesitantly walked away, Vrugbod and Dazale in tow, when his companion shouted, bringing him around sharply. "Wait!" the second man cried weakly. "You're not listening. As well as the threat of raiders, we've been hearing the call of a puma in the hills at night. You can't sleep outside. Dizelle smiled at the flustered man, his enchanting eyes both compelling the villager to relax and boring into him with a sense of power that would have otherwise struck fear into the man's heart. The first man looked on, absorbed in Dizelle's presence, and swallowed as he listened. "See my large companion here?" he asked. "Don't you think he's more than a match for a lonely puma?" "Well, yes, but my good fellow, I'm grateful for your concern, but you needn't worry about us. We've faced more violent opponents than a mountain cat, and survived to tell the tales." Dizelle threw his arm around the man's thin shoulder again. "What did you say your name was?" Vrookbod shook his square-jawed head as his friends worked his verbal magic. On the villagers, charming them with his wit and natural charisma until they were practically entranced. Dizelle gave off an overwhelming, powerful, yet friendly psychic scent that made almost anyone around him feel both at ease and compelled to obey him. Combined with intentional words and gestures, his persuasive presence served him well. The villagers brought firewood and stacked it before the strange travelers, along with a large bucket of fresh water and several blankets. The big orc had wondered if the sword mage was mesmerizing him in the same way, talking him in circles until he was utterly charmed. Yet, as he listened to Dizelle speak with the villagers, Vrookbod knew it was not the same. Sure, the respect and friendliness was there, but a stronger, more cutting tone seemed to demand their compliance. Dizelle always spoke in a compelling and charming manner, but the way he spoke to Vrookbod seemed different. In the 2 years they had been companions, he had seen Dizelle use his verbal magic on a number of occasions, his other magic less so. It appeared to the orc that his ability to charm almost anyone was innate. It was just part of who Dizelle was, while the rarer magic he could wield with a conscious decision, and far less subtle. Vrookbod sat leaning his broad back against the smooth rock of the mountain, his thick hands gripping the shaft of his twin-blade battle axe as the point between the blades sank into the ground under its weight. He sighed, wondering exactly why he was there. He rolled his neck, cracking the vertebrae loudly, and smiled, revealing the full length of his fangs as his thick lips tightened. In truth, he knew exactly why he was there. Ever since Dizelle had helped him escape from the arena where he had been forced to fight to kill, he had loved the man like a brother. Vrookbod took out a large knife that looked small in his thick fingers and a chunk of cherry wood he had been working on for some time. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers surprisingly agile as he manipulated the wood. The legs were already visible, and even though he had not added much detail, it was obvious to anyone who saw it that it was a deer. A doe now that the antlers had snapped off during a short fall down a ravine on the way to this village. Vrookbod shaved minute sections of wood from the block, shaping and refining the doe as the world seemed to fade around him. His concentration centered on the animal he was carving to such a degree that the village fell silent, and all he could hear was the sound of knife cutting wood. It might have been hours later when Dizelle joined him, seating himself silently beside the orc and peering at the creation in his large blue hands. "That's coming on nicely," Dizelle said, adjusting his cloak and swords. "I managed to persuade the gent that greeted us to share a couple of fish," he said cheerfully, presenting a wooden plate with a pair of grilled trout on top. "It doesn't look like they've got much," Vrookbod said. "You didn't take the last of their fish, did you?" The orc watched as the realization hit the sword mage. The poverty in the village was obvious, and a little color rose in Dizelle's cheeks. "Ah, Vrookbod," he sighed, "that big heart of yours will end up getting us in trouble." Slapping the orc on the shoulder, he continued, "But tonight they seem to have more than enough. Besides, the act of giving is often better than receiving. Better we give them the rare pleasure to feed some handsome strangers." He chuckled as he chewed on the charred fish. Somewhere in the hills beyond, the growling whine of a puma echoed across the rocks. Bright sun shone into Dizelle's eyes, waking him from a deep and pleasant sleep that had involved dreaming about a strange past that made no sense. He rolled into a standing position and stretched, glancing around for his gigantic companion who was nowhere to be seen. How do you lose a 7-foot orc? A crunch of gravel surprised him, and he spun around to see a young woman approaching. Dazelle watched the woman with curious anticipation as she stepped towards him with a simple basket in her hands. She looked slightly out of place among the poor villagers, appearing soft and almost elegant. Long, flowing hair fell in dark waves over her shoulders. Her clothes were simple, obviously old, just tattered enough to tell the truth about the difficulties of village life. She smiled at Dazelle as he looked up, her own eyes cutting away from his. "Good morning, sir. How are you today?" she said in a high, clear voice. "Much better now that the company's improved," Dazelle responded with a smile. She smiled back at him, blushing, her presence warm. "What I would give to remember the days of my youth. So, to what do I owe this pleasant and welcome visit this fine morning?" he inquired. "I was asked to bring you a little breakfast," she said, peeling back the cloth cover from her basket. Inside were a pair of simple bread rolls and some odd-looking fruits. "Well, thank you very much," Dazelle said kindly. "We should..." He halted as something caught his eye, and he shaded his vision from the morning sun. "Raiders," he said darkly, "headed here." He turned to face the woman, staring into her eyes. "Let everyone in the village know. Go. Raise the alarm." Her eyes widened with fright as his demeanor changed, shifting to reveal the fierce warrior within. The old-looking man that had greeted them yesterday appeared, eyeing the dusty trail that wound down the mountain like a ribbon. Dazelle could almost hear the man's bones rattling as the fear took hold of his meager frame. "Phalaris," Dazelle muttered gently. "Have you any idea where my friend Vrogbod is?" No, sir," the villager stammered. "I haven't seen." His gaze returned to the dust cloud stirring up by the approaching band. They only let you know they're coming to frighten you," Dazelle said in the calm voice. What? Phalaris asked, turning to look at Dazelle with a sick expression on his face. "The raiders," Dazelle nodded at the group. "They only stir all that dust up to let you know they're coming. That way you're scared when they arrive and more likely to give in to anything they ask." He reached out and squeezed the man's shoulders. "Don't give them the power," he added. Phalaris backed away, running across the village square to his humble shack while Dazelle watched the raiders approach. He knew from the bitter experience what these men were capable of, but also knew they preferred not to kill. Fewer people, fewer resources. Dazelle swore beneath his breath when it became obvious just how many there were. At least 7 in the main force, and possibly as many following somewhere as backup. Dazelle briefly considered whether to get involved in helping the village, but his sense of right soon came to the fore. Besides, anything else and they would be unlikely to get a positive outcome when the gnome returned. The sword mage sat patiently on a log and took a bite from the tasteless roll the young woman had brought him, chewing it thoughtfully as the raiding party rode into the village. Chapter 2. Meeting the Blacksmith. Vrogbod smiled as he watched the children playing in the morning sun. They had come to the field in the early morning, 3 of them, and had been running and chasing each other ever since. He listened to their joyful squeals and laughter, relishing the sounds he had rarely heard, being more used to the roar of screaming crowds and the moans of dying men. The trio, 2 boys and a girl, settled among the stems and began weaving grass into crowns threaded with flowers. "I'm going to give mine to Mama," the girl said, rising slowly from her crouched position. The 2 boys stood as well, probably brothers looking out for their sister, and the 3 of them trotted across the field towards the spot where Vrogbod crouched. About halfway across the field, one of the boys looked up, halting and grabbing his brother and sister as all 3 caught sight of the tall orc watching them. "Have no fear," Vrogbod called to them. "I came only to ensure the puma stayed away." The children looked around nervously, checking to see if the big cat was about to pounce on them. "I don't see it," the eldest called over to him. "It could probably scent me," Vrogbod said. "I'm sure she'll stay away." "She?" the girl asked. Vrogbod nodded. "I could smell her last night," he said. "She came in to about half a mile off, to see what was in the village. Only half a mile, the youngest boy repeated, staring at his siblings with wide eyes. All three children looked towards their home, realizing just how far from it they had come. Rugbod could smell the fear that poured from the three children, watching their eyes dart about from him to the land around them in panic. "She won't come near you while I'm here," the massive creature growled. "What's that?" the eldest boy asked, pointing. Rugbod turned to look, seeing the cloud of dust thrown up by a group of raiders heading for the village. He was about to tell the children to hide, but knew they would just want to be with their parents, and instead chose to take them home. "Stay behind me," Rugbod said in a dark growl. "When you get home, seek shelter. Leave this to Dizel and me." He fixed each child with his dark red eyes. "Understand?" The trio nodded, swallowing as deeper fear clamped chilly fingers around their young chests. Rugbod set off at an easy lope, checking to see that they could keep up with him. 6 snorting horses stirred up a cloud of dirt as they rode into the middle of the village, where Dizel sat on a log, elbows on knees, staring at the ground. Eventually, the dust blew gently out of the village, settling on the grass like a sprinkling of pepper. One of the riders walked his horse over to where Dizel sat, still staring at the ground. "Who are you?" he demanded. Dizel looked up slowly, his hood falling back to reveal his light blue eyes and the hard planes of his face. "Morning, my good fellow," he piped up. "My name is Dizel, and the king granted me this land for services to the crown. Are you the chaps he sent to protect us?" The raider grinned, revealing a row of perfectly white teeth, a nasty chuckle rippling from his chest. His companions laughed as well, and Dizel frowned at the men. Each was dressed in a similar fashion, mainly in leather and armor. Any cloth they did wear was dark brown and tatty. Each carried a sword of varying quality, and Dizel's eyes instinctively picked out the best places to stab or slash at them, his brain formulating a plan to kill them all. "Yes, that's us," the leader said. "There's just a little matter of payment first." His eyes fixed on Dizel's, but it was the rider who flinched. Dizel stood, letting his cloak fall from his shoulders to reveal what was beneath. Strapped to his body, attached by belts, buckles, and straps, sat a pair of swords, one on each hip, several weighted throwing darts, daggers, and knives. A small hatchet and a whip-like weapon formed of flexible metal that was wrapped around his waist like a belt. "What's this?" the raider gulped. "You've got one chance to leave alive," Dizel said, every last scrap of his usually pleasant demeanor gone. "We'll leave when we've got what we came for," the mounted man growled, laying his hand on his sword. Dizel's movements were a blur, his hand moving to his chest and flicking one of his darts at the leader. It pierced the man's throat, the 3-inch spike emerging just to the right of his spine. His arms jerked, stiff fingers raking at the sky as if imploring the gods to end his suffering. Blood spluttered and darkened the dusty ground before him as the raider, eyes rolling back in his head, pitched sideways and hit the ground with an explosive grunt. His sword had only emerged from its scabbard by an inch. 3 seconds passed silently before the other raiders realized what had happened. Expecting nothing more than a few unarmed farmers, they were shocked at the attack, but the surprise quickly faded as 2 of them trotted at Dizel. Twin swords appeared in Dizel's hands as if magically conjured by his speed, and he ducked under a poorly aimed blow from the right-hand attacker, straining to bury his right-hand sword in the belly of the left-hand man. Spinning like a dancer, he jabbed his left-hand sword under the first man's ribs, piercing his back and lung. Dizel sheathed both of his swords, turning to face the last 2 as the second pair of 2 pitched from their saddles dead. Barely breathing any faster than he did when he'd been sitting on the log, Dizel stared up at the remaining pair. "We don't want any trouble," one said in a voice high with fright. "Too late," Dizel grunted. "Really, we'll just go. This was all Duning's idea." He pointed to one of the dead men. "Where's your other friend?" Dizel asked flatly. "Who?" Even now the raiders thought they might win. Dizel sighed. 7 rode up, 6 came in here, he stated. "That leaves 1 out there somewhere, an archer or crossbowman probably. Where?" The mounted riders glanced at each other nervously, knowing they should have the advantage here, but also knowing they faced a deadly opponent. Dazelle took his right-hand sword out at the same time as an arrow exploded against its edge, making even him jump. The mounted raiders gaped in awe at the feat they had just witnessed. Gods be praised, who are you? One stammered. Before Dazelle could answer, a deep bellow exploded from the hill to the west, echoing and reverberating from the rocks around them. Dazelle smiled. "You're in trouble now," he said. Someone screamed off to the right, the sound growing louder as the last raider soared over the line of huts, his bow snapped and arms flailing as he smashed to the ground, something vital inside him breaking as he hit, bringing another scream. He rolled several times, coming to a halt at the base of Flaris' house, groaning in pain. His two comrades stared at their friend, eyes cutting toward Vrogbod as he stormed at them, fangs bared, bellowing, and with his massive axe swinging in his hands. Panic made their horses rear, whinnying in terror as the orc approached, throwing one rider to the ground. Vrogbod swung a fist the size of a warhammer at the man, smashing his body, the head snapping backward. Finding himself alone, with 6 of his friends either dead, incapacitated, and facing a raging orc, the last of the raiders wheeled his terrified horse around and rode for the trail, straight into the path of the gnome coming the other way. Desperately trying to avoid the gnome's cart, the fleeing raider steered his horse to the right. Dazelle watched as something flashed in the sun, and the raider dropped from his horse like a boulder. A loud crunch came to his ears a few seconds later, and Dazelle realized that the gnome had bashed a man's skull with something heavy. Vrogbod stood beside Dazelle as the gnome drove his cart up the track towards him slowly. When he reached the village, the gnome surveyed the carnage the pair had wrought, his emerald eyes flowing over the scene. "Well, I wasted my time in bringing all this," the stout creature grumbled as people started to emerge from their homes. Dazelle looked to the bed of his cart where the gnome had a few poor weapons and farming implements rusting in a pile. Behind him, the villagers were responding in one of 2 ways. The older ones were fearful of reprisals for the raiders' deaths, while the younger generation were thrilled at the victory. "Are you Ronbin?" Dazelle asked. He realized as soon as he'd asked that it was a stupid question. How many other gnomes lived in this region? "Who wants to know?" Ronbin asked, jumping down from his cart. Dazelle watched his odd walk, his whole body swaying from side to side as if his legs didn't bend correctly. Resembling a pendulum, Ronbin moved among the dead, stripping them of weapons and any of the clothing he wanted, throwing it all in his little cart. His beard, carefully braided and oiled, was tucked into a black leather belt at his waist, and his long ears poked out of the hair that flowed down his back. Bright yellow skin had been tattooed with tribal designs that crawled up his arms, appearing to come alive with his every movement. Light green patches on his face complemented his emerald eyes, but his expression remained resolutely dour, as if everything he came across was offensive. "I'm Dazelle, and this is Vrogbod," Dazelle said, retrieving his cloak from the log. "And why should I care?" Ronbin asked as he casually cut the throat of the raider Vrogbod had punched unconscious. "We both woke up 10 years ago with no idea who we were," Dazelle said. Ronbin snapped up, fixing his attention on Dazelle fully for a second, and the sword mage knew he'd found someone like them. Ronbin sucked in a deep breath, scratched his long nose and shrugged. "You'd better come to my home then," he said. While the villagers used the raiders' own horses to carry their bodies up into the rocky hills for the scavengers to eat, Dazelle and Vrogbod followed the little gnome to his workshop. Inside, the forge radiated heat even though it looked as if the flames had been doused ages ago. Larger than many of the other homes and constructed from better materials, Ronbin's smithy workshop was his home and far more comfortable than the rest. A single large room held a small table and single chair, while a low cot had been added in one corner for sleeping. His pantry consisted of little more than a few sacks of flour, oats, and some dried fruits and meats. His smithy, in contrast, was as well stocked as Dazelle had ever seen. He had a range of anvils, numerous pairs of pliers to pull molten metal from the flames, hammers in several different sizes and shapes, as well as buckets of water in which to temper his products. Say your piece and go, Ronbin said bluntly. Dazelle glanced at Rookbod, who had to virtually crouch to get into the room. I woke up in a field, Dazelle said, not knowing who I was, where I was, or where I'd come from. I had nothing apart from the clothes on my back. Dazelle stared into the depths of his past, his gaze blank as he recalled what had befallen him. First thing I remember is being hit, whipped, by someone on a horse. It turned out he was an overseer on a farm that used slaves, and I ended up as one of them. Wasn't long before I had a few stripes across my back. All day in the burning sun with only a quick break to eat and drink, I tilled the soil alongside many other men and women in the same situation as I. At dusk we would be rounded up in the back of a cart and driven to a large building where all slept on piles of moldy straw. No sooner had I shut my eyes when we were being screamed at to get up again. Another day of weeding and whipping. I discovered the others there had a history that I had no knowledge of. I understood them, could speak the language, but didn't know my own name. That I was from some place known as the Salt Marshes, where no one ever returns alive. That I was a dangerous stranger, bringing bad luck to everyone. To be honest, they were right about that. The owners definitely had it in for me, and whoever was near me ended up sharing my beatings. It was too risky for them to associate with me. They kept their distance, avoiding me for fear of what might happen to them. Dazelle let out a sigh and continued. For 6 months, the torture and beatings continued, all through a harsh winter where several slaves died from exposure. We clung to life as best as we could. When the warmth of spring came once more, I decided to run. I thought my luck had come, but the overseers caught sight of me and chased me down. I ended up on my knees, exhausted, with my back to a wall by a farmhouse, expecting to be beaten to death. In desperation, I grabbed a wooden hoe, and that was when something happened to me. I realized it felt different in my hands than when I had been working in the fields with the hoe. It was as if my body was telling me something. When I stood up and faced him, I just felt different, he trailed off. So? Ronbin asked, his arms folded. Dazelle looked at the dispassionate creature as anger rose in his chest. The point is, Dazelle carried on, his voice a little louder, I had talents that I didn't know I had. At that moment, something inside me came back. That's the only way I could describe it. Like a rush of memories that weren't mine. Anyway, I fought off 4 men armed with whips and swords, wielding nothing more than a wooden stick. Broke one's arm, another his leg, and a third one I hit in the throat so hard his windpipe collapsed. When I turned to the 4th, he was already running away. I grabbed what I could and never looked back, but it was as if there was someone else inside my body. That's an inspiring story, Ronbin said in a flat voice. Rogbud growled low in his chest, his red eyes fixing angrily on the gnome as his fists clenched tightly. Ronbin's emerald eyes lingered on the orc, his expression one of indifference. Have you never wanted to know why it happened? Dazelle asked. Never in 10 years wanted to know who you were, where you were from, know your youth, your past? Not really, Ronbin said. I already know where I'm from and who I am. So we were misled, Dazelle muttered sickly, frustrated at his waste of time. Quite a few people told us you claimed to have woken with no memories. Is it all a lie? Dazelle's blue eyes flashed with anger as he stared at the gnome, and even Ronbin's yellow skin paled a little. No, the gnome said. You have it right. I did wake up 10 years ago with no recollections of who or what I was. Those who found me told me they entered a previously unreachable, sealed cave and found me there, unharmed but unconscious. They brought me out and cared for me until I woke, he added, with no memories. It seemed almost as if admitting it made it real, and Dazelle could see the worry etched in the gnome's face as he described the experience. Somehow felt I was a metallurgist and blacksmith, gifted at extracting iron from rock and turning it into steel before shaping it and creating things with my hands. The people who found me went and told the gnome clan, and the clan came and took me to their village. My new clan supported me through the loss of my identity. eased me into my new life. He paused, looking wistfully into Dizel's eyes. I even knew happiness for a time. A momentary smile flicked across his face, then ruefully disappeared again. He paused, let out a sigh, and continued, whatever happened to me, they think it was some kind of head injury from a rock fall in the mines. It only took some of my memories, as when I took up my tools, I knew exactly how to use them, the exact formulas to make the strongest steel. Ronvin's eyes glistened as he recalled the memories. Rugbod looked around the small room, then back at Ronvin and asked with a quizzical tone, so how did you end up here? Ronvin looked at him, an expression of despair falling over his features. It's odd, he mumbled. But somehow, I knew I wasn't what they believed. I looked and acted like a gnome, but inside I knew I was different. Dizel leaned forward, recognizing his own past in the gnome's words. Go on. I married, Ronvin continued. A good female gnome who cared for me. Doted on me, really. He glanced at the human and orc guiltily. I didn't really want her in any way, despite her patience and love for me. Ronvin turned away. We ended up arguing more and more often, and eventually my anger nearly led me to hit her. It was at that moment I knew she deserved better, so I packed up a few things and left. Silence dropped over the room like a sour blanket, none of them wishing to break it, and all of them bathing in similar memories of their own. I spent years wandering the land, earning a few coins here and there with my skills like a tinker, until my path led me here to this remote place. The villagers here welcomed me, as no one else had. They helped me build this home. In return, I mend their tools and maintain their carts. He spread his hands. And that's enough for you? Rugbod rumbled deeply. Yes, Ronvin replied shortly. Dizel shook his head and stood, moving for the door. Looks like we've wasted our time and energy coming here then, he said with a firm edge to his voice. You're leaving? Ronvin asked, his eyes wide with surprise. We came here with the belief that you would be more receptive to discovering what befell us all and possibly helping locate others like us, Dizel said. Now I see you've got no interest in any of that, so we might as well be on our way. Dizel playing with words and emotions, planting thoughts in others? If it's taken you 10 years to find each other and me, the gnome said, tugging at his nose, how long is it gonna take to find others? I thought I was unique for about 8 years, Dizel said, honing my skills and leading armies, even a little stint as a mercenary. It was pure chance that led me to Rugbod and a random meeting with a drunk outside a tavern that told me he shared a history like mine. Ronvin took a stick from his stack of firewood and dipped one end into his forge, pulling the blackened tip out and scratching something on the wall. Ever seen this before? He asked. Dizel stared at the marks the gnome had made, 3 upright strokes, equidistant from each other but with the middle one slightly smaller, and felt something move inside him. What was that? It had felt like excitement, but on a seismic scale, as if the world around them shared in his ecstasy. He glanced at Rugbod and noticed that the big orc appeared to be smiling, a rare expression for him. What is that? Dizel asked. No idea, Ronvin shrugged, stroking his beard through his hands. All I do know is that whenever something important has happened near me, he tapped the symbol. This has been somewhere close by. I'd be willing to bet my forge that it was somewhere nearby when you two met. I don't think so, Dizel started, but Rugbod held up one immense hand, his red eyes glued to the symbol. I've seen it, he said in a deep voice. It was scribbled on the wall in my cage beneath the arena. I thought it was the work of some poor soul who wrote it over and over again across the stonework. Fear and madness drove men to do strange things in here. He trailed off. Neither Dizel nor Ronvin pressed him for further information. When I was digging the holes for these uprights, Ronvin said, patting one of the round beams holding his roof aloft, I unearthed a boulder about the size of my head, carved and etched in some strange material I've never seen before. Was this? He stabbed his stick at the symbol. Before I had time to think, it dissolved away in front of my own eyes. The same damn symbol that I keep seeing when good things happen was on that boulder, and must have laid in the ground for years before I came along and pulled it out. So what does that symbol mean? And who or what put that symbol on a rock and left it 2 feet under the soil for me to find and then disappear? Why? Dizel spread his hands as certainty grew inside him. He had to get this gnome to come with him. Had to. He turned back towards the door again. Where are you headed? Ronbin asked. South, Dizel replied with a smile. Why? I may need to contact you if I hear anything, that is. Ronben refused to meet Dizel's eyes when he turned. The sword mage reached out, gesturing for the stick in Ronbin's hands, and the gnome passed it. Dizel scratched the location of one of his friends in a nearby city. Get a message, Sam, and he will get it to me, Dizel said. Without another word, he turned and left the hut. Chapter 3. Gaining the Gnome.